Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Jones-Sherbinsky, and I am the Executive Director of Lahontan Audubon Society. I'm very excited to welcome you here tonight for our presentation on Pinyon Jays with Great Basin Bird Observatory. Just a few announcements before we get rolling. We are kind of wrapping up all of our events for 2021, but we are looking forward to 2022. Don't have any field trips currently on the calendar, but we are working on getting some scheduled, as well as we are working on a field trip leader training, which we will be sharing more details about in the near future. So we're excited to hopefully recruit some new folks, get folks comfortable out there leading field trips for us, and that will help us to offer more activities for everybody. All right, we also have, I'm happy to announce, one of our board members, as well as our conservation committee chair, Rose Strickland, is joining us tonight. Rose has been doing so much amazing work for us here at LAS, and she is the one who brought the Pinyon Jay program to our attention and has been helping to drive it forward. So I'm going to go ahead and let Rose take it away and give a little introduction to the program we have tonight.
Hi there.
Hi, Rose.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you. This is going to be an exciting program. This bird is a kind of icon of the Great Basin and our Pinyon Juniper woodlands. And, but not a lot of studies have been done in Western Nevada, where we are, Reno, Carson City area. So this is a great opportunity for us to go out into the woodlands. And our job is simply to record the number of birds we see and enter the data, and it will be provided to Great Basin Bird Observatory and other agencies that are trying to find out where are our Pinyon Jays. We know, and you'll hear a lot about it in the program tonight, that the population has had a very significant decline. And so we are going to be supplying very important data to the people who are studying these birds so that we can take care of the habitat problems. Thank you. Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks, Rose. I also wanted to mention for anybody who joined a little bit late, if you have questions, we will have time. We have two presenters from Great Basin Bird Observatory tonight. So we will have a little bit of time in between the two presenters to answer some questions about the first half of the presentation, but we will also have time at the end for questions and answers. If you have questions that come up throughout the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A, or if you're watching us on Facebook, you can put them in the comments and we'll be monitoring them there. And with that, I think we're ready to get rolling. I'm happy to introduce Ned Bowman and Kayla Henry from Great Basin Bird Observatory. Ned's going to be starting us off with some natural history and background about Pinyon Jays. So Ned, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Jenny. And thanks, Rose and Parker and Diane, for having us tonight. It's a pleasure to speak to you all. And also thanks for plugging the CBCs, Parker. I'm traveling and missing all the Reno area ones, but I'm actually down in Southern Arizona in my truck in Ramsey Canyon right now. So I apologize for any gaps in my internet, but I'll be participating in a CBC down here tomorrow. So for the greater good. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, I think you should all be able to see me and my show. So my name is Ned Bowman.
Oops, Ned, your voice kind of cut out because of the video sound, I think.
Oh, are you able to hear me now?
I can hear you now, yep.
Okay. Well, if anyone didn't hear me, I am Ned Bowman, an outreach biologist with Great Basin Bird Observatory, and I have personally done a lot of these pinyon surveys that we're going to be talking about tonight. So they look like that. I hope they're familiar. I'm sure they're a distinct and familiar bird to a lot of folks in the audience tonight with their blue-gray. They're shorter tailed than a lot of our other jays. They have a long, strong bill for probing into cones and caching seeds. Um, they have those familiar high-pitched nasal ringing calls that I'm sure you all are familiar with, but they also have a number of more complex specialized vocalizations that you hear a bit less frequently. Um, and you can actually tell, sometimes you can tell the males from the females. They tend to be, there are differences that are observable, but they are not always concrete. So it's sort of on a spectrum. But I would suspect that that bird in the picture there is an adult male because of how blue his face is. The females tend to not be so blue, but you can't always tell. They're a highly social bird. You saw that photo on the last slide was actually taken at one of our baiting stations that we were maintaining while we were working on one of these flocks. They have a complex flock structure. It's typically made up of a bunch of family groups, and birds typically don't leave their natal flock, but when they do, it's early in their years. And the younger males will sometimes even not participate in breeding on their own in their first year, but as helper birds to their parents. So there's a lot of interesting social dynamics with these guys that I got to know personally from just being up close and personal with them. But they're also very important seed dispersers and are strongly tied to the Pinyon Juniper woodlands. And that's sort of one of the most important things about them, is that they have a remarkable memory and ability to remember where they have stashed these seeds for later consumption, even through snow and all sorts of variables. It's very impressive. But they use that strong bill to cache their seeds, often in the ground, usually in the ground in loose sandy substrate. But I've seen them cache in the crevices of trunks of trees before. They're very clever, and they'll do what they can with what they've got. And you can see that bird in the bottom picture really getting at those pine nuts there. And so they are declining precipitously, as you can see in the figure on the top right. These are both put together with data from the Breeding Bird Survey program. And that graph that spans from 1970 to 2010. I believe my thing's in the way and I can't see. But it's a very steep decline. And then my figures in the center there, you can see that decline is actually steeper in Nevada and the Great Basin than it is when you look at the range as a whole. And then just to highlight that map on the bottom, you can see where the darkest red is where the most birds are found. And Central Nevada and northern New Mexico are really the strongholds of the Pinyon Jay. So they really do have a strong connection to Nevada. And I'll get into more about that decline later. But I want to talk a little bit about the habitat that they use, because they're classically considered pinyon juniper forest obligates, yet we are commonly finding them in foothill habitat, and they clearly are using different habitats for different reasons. But both of those photos are photos that I took in locations where I had observed pinyon jays, and you'll notice that neither is a particularly dense woodland. So some interesting points there. And it's suspected that variability in the pine nut crop pushes them to new areas. They're not a migratory bird per se, but pinyon pines are a masting species, meaning they produce nuts in greater quantities in some years than others. So in some years when their home patch, if you will, doesn't produce as much as it has in some years, they'll actually travel very far distances in some cases to seek out productive stand. And their caching sites actually become new pinyon juniper stands, well, pinyon stands, because well, seeds grow when they're in the ground and left there. So they actually cultivate their own habitat in a way. But so pinyon juniper woodlands, I'm sure you guys, most of you guys in the audience are familiar. It's a classic habitat type in the Great Basin, occurs throughout the Intermountain West, generally a little higher elevation where there's a little bit more precipitation to support the trees. And as I just mentioned, the pinyon pines produce nuts, which are a very energy-rich food source for pinyon jays and a number of other wildlife species. But this crop production is variable from year to year, so it causes some variability in pinyon jay behavior. And they'll share this habitat with birds like black-throated gray warblers, juniper titmice, western tanagers, Cassin's finches, critters like that. We also see them using sagebrush steppe habitat, which is arguably the most abundant habitat type in the Great Basin, is at least very characteristic scene of the Great Basin. And it's often found adjacent to pinyon juniper woodlands, a little higher elevation than your lower elevation shrub communities. It's definitely distinct from the shrubs you'll find in the valley floors, which is your salt bushes and your greasewoods. These are going to be a little higher up with more precipitation. And they share these with a number of obligate species, conservation priority species, as well as cultural priorities. So this factors into a lot of management concerns when looking at this bird. But the sage thrasher, brewer sparrow, sagebrush sparrow, and greater sage-grouse are in fact all obligate species and conservation priorities. And at least the greater sage-grouse is a cultural priority. The other songbirds are not such cultural icons as the sage-grouse is. And then this habitat type is sometimes overlooked, but it is a definitely distinct habitat type used by a huge array of wildlife species beyond just birds. But there's not a hard line between your pinyon juniper woodlands and your shrub communities. They fade in between one another. And these foothill lower slope areas are where we are finding pinyon jays more often than not. And there's a number of other bird species that use these, and a number of which are also conservation concerns. But excuse me, blue-gray gnatcatcher, Scott's oriole, gray vireo, black-chin sparrow in the southern part of the range are all birds that use this foothill ecotone edge habitat, where you get sort of the best of both worlds of two distinct habitat types coming together. And you may think that it resembles where areas that have been identified as conifer encroachment in the early stages, where they are not yet a dense forest, but it is still not a shrubland. This is the ecotone and is classic pinyon jay habitat. And so we have a lot of things going on with these habitats. You can see in that top photo the sort of infill of conifers, where they just become more dense. The stand becomes more dense, more covered, more shaded in the understory. And then the other photo in the bottom is what is called Counterfeit Expansion, where the trees are quote unquote marching downhill and colonizing areas that were previously shrubland. And so in addition to all that, you have the shifting climate, you have what's going on with our wildfires, increased frequency and intensity, and you've got impacts from grazing animals, both livestock and wild, like elk and deer and wild horses. So there's a lot of things going on with pinyon jay habitat, and it's not exactly clear. It's kind of a mystery that we are sorting out. There's just not a lot to go on, so that's why we are doing what we are doing and trying to figure out where the pinyon jays are. So historically, there has been, in like the late 1800s, there was a lot of deforestation for mining and grazing activities. So in the last 100 years, pinyon juniper woodlands have increased in extent and stand density, yet lost understory. So it's difficult to untangle with all that's going on. And you might think, well, if pinyon juniper woodlands are increasing in extent, how are these birds that are classic users of this habitat type declining? and what might be going on here. And the suspicion is that it has to do with habitat quality, obviously, rather than just the presence of available habitat. So what we need to figure out is what it is about these habitats that they are identifying as high quality and low quality. But there are a lot of variables to suss out, so it's not necessarily a straightforward issue. Currently, land management habitat improvement for greater sage-grouse is pretty widespread in these foothill areas that I was just describing. And the effect of these activities on pinyon jays is functionally unstudied and unknown. There are conflicting ideas on management, and as I mentioned before, those cultural priorities of your wild horses and your greater sage-grouses. A lot more people are familiar with them as charismatic species rather than the pinyon jay. So there are a lot of implications to land management here, and we're finding out a lot of information that doesn't necessarily agree with the traditional knowledge of pinyon jays. So thinning of the stands is potentially something that can get at, as I mentioned before, the infill, the increase in stand density, the loss of understory. Thinning these stands could create habitat for pinyon jays, but there's a lot of differing ideas, like, does this thinning promote evapotranspiration and decrease the health of trees as we're seeing more aridity and increased drought? Does thinning the trees help free up water resources by allowing less trees using the same amount of water, so each tree getting more water? Does that then increase the stand health? So there's a lot of things to consider here and a lot of unknowns. And so that's why we're doing what we're doing, to sort of untangle these variables and get at where the pinyon jays are and to try to figure out why they might be there. And so a lot of what we have done in the past, we have done some focus studies with telemetry data and observational nest monitoring type studies. And we also have our Nevada bird count program that is not necessarily ideal for targeting pinyon jays, but has nonetheless given us a lot of data points on pinyon jay location. And so these telemetry studies we've done in the Desatoya mountain range, as well as the Snake Range, which is in eastern Nevada and Great Basin National Park, and the Pine Nut Mountain Range, which is just south of Reno and east of Carson City. And the Desatoyas are central Nevada, if I didn't mention that previously. So we've tried to get at things like home range size. We've seen a lot of variability between the flocks. It's helped us understand a lot more of their seasonal habitat use by doing this telemetry in the winter versus in the breeding season. So we're getting to see some of the differences between the sites they are choosing for nesting and roosting as opposed to foraging and caching. We're finding that they do tend to use slightly denser stands for nesting and roosting, and they're foraging in this edge habitat and they're caching in the edge, and sometimes even in pure sagebrush, our caching sites. And I mentioned our Nevada bird count is a statewide monitoring program that began in the early 2000s. And it's been a long time since we've had true statewide coverage, but nonetheless, our contracts do take us pretty far and wide throughout the state. And while it's not an ideal survey protocol for a bird like the pinyon jay, it's much more apt for territorial songbirds, where you're getting density info and each bird is maintaining a territory of a set size, regularly being found there. Whereas pinyon jays are using the habitat in a different way. They're using the landscape on a larger scale. So point counts are just not going to be as ideal for getting the information we are hoping to gather on them. And this in the next few slides so we've put these together with our telemetry data. So those yellow lines are flight paths, and the shaded in figures are areas where the birds were actually on the ground or in the trees on the ground using the habitat. And you can see they're pretty clustered right around the edges of where the trees are. And again, those red outlines are polygons where the birds were actually on the ground or caching in trees. And then the lines that are not so visible in this one are their flight paths to and from. And so this one might show a little better their preference for edge sites, because it really is the edge of the mountains. On the left side, you've got sagebrush, and on the right side, you've got the mountains going higher and higher. And all of these polygons are right at the edge, at the very lowest elevation where there are trees. And you can see their flight paths covering sometimes pretty great distances between these patches. But generally what we're finding is they're roosting and nesting in these denser stands that are still within 800 meters of an edge. And the use of stands greater than that from an edge, we are finding pretty rarely. And this is another slide showing that, but you can see some of these sites are way out in the sagebrush, and these flight paths are going across huge patches of sagebrush. And all of those polygons right at the edge where the trees are least dense, lower elevation, lower in slope. And again, just to drive that point home again, that black dot there is sort of a control site, and not necessarily a site that we had controlled for, but a site of what is generally available on the landscape in terms of these variables. So, and you can see the different colors are for the blue for nesting, the purple for foraging, and the green for caching. But for each activity, they are generally lower, flatter, younger, and more open than what is generally available on the landscape, which does suggest a preference of habitat. And again, these box and whisker plots show the CA for caching, F for foraging, N for nesting, CO for control. In each category, they are skewed to lower elevation, lower slopes, less dense stands, closer to the edge. So I think I covered a lot of the things that were going on. Kayla is going to talk a bit about our plans, some of our recent activity and what we're doing into the future. But agencies are becoming concerned. Partners in Flight has formed a working group, which we are heavily involved with. And I'm going to hand it over to Kayla. And just a thanks to all of our agency partners. And when this slideshow is posted, those links are great resources to the Partners in Flight Working Group, our own community science page, and the Birds of the World species account has some great info on Pinyon Jays. So if anyone has any questions, I am happy to take them. Otherwise, I will let Kayla jump in with what our plans are.
Looks like we do have a few questions so far. Sherm Swanson asks, in some places, Native Americans created and maintained orchards of pinyon pine by thinning the stand. This would have increased the pine nut crop. Would this have likely been useful for pinyon jays?
Yes and no, because those tribes are often harvesting those nuts themselves. So depending on the level of harvest and who gets to the nuts first, that is the habitat that the birds are using. So in theory, yes, that would create opportunities for pinyon jays, but because the tribes have the same motives, to be determined.
Yep. He also said the openness of foraging and the greater openness of caching sites suggests a facilitated relationship with fire over decades of time. I guess not a question, but a comment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to see what's happening with fire. It's yeah, we've had a history of fire suppression, and now we're seeing really intense fires more frequently, and it's all really recent. So the effects on the landscape and all of its far-reaching effects on these connected webs are sort of remaining to be seen, and we're watching them play out.
Yeah. And the last one we have for now is from Susan S. Do they eat the juniper berries? They occasionally visit my bird feeders for sunflower seeds, and I think they eat the peanuts near the Carson River.
They definitely like peanuts. I'm not so sure about the juniper berries. I definitely see them using juniper trees, but generally it has been hammering pinyon nuts into nooks and crannies in the bark.
Interesting.
I have not personally observed them eating juniper berries. Not to say they do not, but I do not know of it myself.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right, then I will get
one more quickly, and then we will pass it off.
Sure.
Alan
What do we got?
DeCaro's just asked. I've often seen pinyon jays in and near Ponderosa, Jeffrey pines on the south side slopes of Peavine. Do you know if nesting has been observed there? Have there been studies of pinyon jays where they're not using the pinyon pines?
You know, it's interesting. I don't know exactly is the short answer to that question, but I have also observed them using Jeffrey pines and Ponderosa pines, and they're in the Virginia mountain range north of Reno, which is pretty devoid of pinyons. If anyone's ever been up there, it's all juniper, and there's a couple Jeffrey / Ponderosa pine patches. So what they're doing there, I'm not entirely sure, but I have seen them using that habitat. So that's a long way to say I don't really know. I'm sorry.
No, I think saying I don't know is a great question, or a great answer to a lot of questions.
It's what we need to find out. It's what we're sending you guys out there with your tablets and smartphones to find out.
It looks like somebody else on your staff just chimed in and says it's known that pinyon jays in some regions use areas without pinyon, but the densities are lower and there are fewer studies from that kind of habitat. So yeah, filling in the data gaps. That's what this is all about. We'll go ahead, and you guys can keep putting questions in the Q&A or in the comment section, but we're going to let Kayla go ahead and start her portion of the talk. And if you do have questions for Ned, he'll still be around at the end.
Sharing my screen real quick. Let's see. All right, you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us tonight, Lahan and Audubon. My name is Kayla Henry. I am also an outreach biologist here with Great Basin Bird Observatory. And tonight I'm going to be talking about several things. Ned gave a great introduction and background and everything about the history of pinyon jays in the Great Basin and what we know about them so far from our research at GBBO. Tonight I'm going to be touching on the Pinyon Jay Working Group and our work implementing a Pinyon Jay survey protocol in Arizona this past spring, and how you guys can all get involved with our community science initiative by collecting data with Esri Survey123 App. Right, so the Pinyon Jay Working Group formed in 2017 with the goal of bringing together Pinyon Jay experts to discuss conservation needs for the species, with the mission to develop and share the best available science to best understand, conserve, and manage Pinyon Jays and their habitat. Pinyon Jays are notoriously difficult to study. As Ned touched on, they aren't the best birds to study using the point count method, just for the fact that they're super nomadic. They travel in large flocks across large home ranges, so it's hard to figure out where they are. Earlier this year, the Pinyon Jay Working Group put out recommendations for Pinyon Jay specific studies. The document provides general guidelines that can be used on multiple projects and also be tailored to specific projects, but it also aims to standardize practices. So there's compatibility across all projects. So people are all collecting the same basic information is the main goal with that, which lends to a larger sample size and to better understand the needs of Pinyon Jays. Oops, sorry. I copied over another slide here. Let's get that one. Okay. So this brings us to our work in Arizona this past spring. GBBO had partnered with the Bureau of Land Management and the Arizona Game and Fish Department to conduct Pinyon Jay surveys in northern and central Arizona. And it's important to talk about this work we did tonight, even though it's not in the Great Basin, just to show that this protocol developed by the Pinyon Jay Working Group can be used for different reasons across multiple projects, whether it's something with a more standardized protocol like this project, or to help with a volunteer effort like I'm going to get to later. So we partnered with DLM and Arizona Fish and Game to conduct Pinyon Jay surveys in northern and central Arizona. Our standardized protocol for our Pinyon Jay project differs from what we will be doing with our community science effort. However, basic information being collected is the same. So I wanted to give a brief rundown on this project this spring, because yeah, it does illustrate that the diversity of this protocol. Oops. Okay. Got ahead of myself. Part of the goal, so our main objective was to gather general information across a large landscape and determine presence of Pinyon Jays in high priority treatment areas. And when we're referring to treatment areas, we are referring to Pinyon Juniper removal. So part of the goal was also to test this protocol and lay a framework for an ongoing monitoring program. So for this project, our sampling units were 2.5 by 2.5 kilometer plots. They were systematically surveyed using an area search approach, with surveyors getting within 1 kilometer of every plant on the plot and half a kilometer when possible to ensure coverage. Surveys took anywhere from 3 to 5 hours, with a minimum of 3 hours spent surveying the plot, and each plot was visited up to 3 times before Pinyon Jays were considered absent. Touchy keyboard. Here we have our survey locations shown on the left in northern and central Arizona. And on the right, we have an example of a surveyor route through one of our plots, and routes depended greatly on topography. And I know Ned can speak to this as well. We had some challenging plots to traverse down there with really steep slopes, and it was a challenge for sure, but it was a beautiful area to work, and we did see lots of Pinyon Jays. So all the data was collected using Esri's Field Maps app. Results, here we go. This allowed for surveyors to mark directly on the landscape where they saw the birds, whether it was a polygon or a point. This polygon here would represent a larger flock. So for this particular sighting, they noted a flock size of 30, and they were observed foraging on the ground, kind of taking up a large area. Whereas a point would be reserved for if they maybe saw just a couple Pinyon Jays perched in a tree or had an auditory detection in that plot. Whereas it would be hard to tell right there on the plot boundary if they were actually in the plot or not. And we did count oral detections, or we did record them, but we didn't count them as present because we could not really tell if they were in the boundary of the plot or not. So here's a plot with polygons and points in the associated survey form. So again, you can see they recorded a flock size of 30 birds, with most of the birds foraging on the ground. Just some quick results from this project. We surveyed a total of 74 plots and confirmed Pinyon Jay presence in 59 of those plots. And looking at some of the plots up here, you can see the dots and polygons where Pinyon Jays were observed. So overall, we had a great first season. So the first season of this project, so our surveyors were really troopers to get through it. We had some weather challenges and camping in very cold weather because this project did begin in late February, early March, like when the breeding season begins. But overall, it was a great season. We documented a lot of Pinyon Jays and got to go to some beautiful places. Here are some fun pictures. I think on the top right, it's near the Grand Canyon. The bottom left is Vermilion Cliffs. So let's go to some great places on this project. So this brings us to the next part of my talk, which is our Pinyon Jay Community Science Project. And this is where we need your help in the Great Basin to just get more coverage and learn what's going on here. So you can help GBBO collect data on Pinyon Jays and be a critical contributor to a larger data set for the species. And any sightings you're able to document, help us understand distribution and habitat use of the species. And the more information we have, the better. You might be out birding and just happen to see a flock and want to record it. You could even just be at a highway rest stop and see a flock and record it, or out running errands, wherever. You can also collect absence data, which is also just as important to know where they are versus where they aren't. So in the next few slides, I'm going to be going over Esri's Survey123 app, and I promise it's simple to use, even if you don't consider yourself the most tech-savvy person. We will hopefully make it all clear, and it'll be fun to get out in the field and start collecting some data for us. More information on this is also available at our website, gbbo.org/community-science, and there you can learn more about our work with Pinyon Jays and get the details on downloading Survey123 and how that works and all the instructions. We also have more resources on our YouTube channel, and we have additional webinars about Pinyon Jays and our work with them, so you can check those out as well. Okay, so we're focusing on data collection with the Survey123 app because it's an easy method to get the data in the field. It's free to download on any device, and anyone can use it without a user ID. It can be used with or without internet, and it doesn't take up much storage on your device. So the first step is to download the Survey123 app using Google Play or the Apple Store, depending on what kind of device you have. If you just type in Survey123, it'll pop right up. It's I think it's the first, it should be the first one that pops up. So once you have Survey123 downloaded, you can access the Pinyon Jay survey form. The link is here. I also have a QR code. I hope it's not being obstructed by anything, but it's on the next several slides as well. If you want to try that out, so you can scan that with your camera app and then click the link that pops up, and that'll download the form to your phone for future use. I should note that you need to be connected to Wi-Fi when you initially download the survey form, as well as the Survey123 app. So make sure you do that before going out into the field. All right, so step 3 is to collect data. So record locations of Pinyon Jays. And this helps us at GBBO understand their distribution and habitat use. And the more information we have on that, the better. And we just need more bodies out there collecting information, because there are just so many places they could be. And like Meg was saying, we don't really know what is considered, like really what habitats they're using. We have a good idea in some areas, but we just need more information. So this app can be used anytime Pinyon Jays are observed or to collect absence data. So if you're going to do a survey and say the Pinyon Jays are absent from that location, we ask that you spend at least 20 minutes at that site to confirm absence, and that's just a way to standardize that number so that we know if anyone's turning in a survey with absence data, we know they all at least spent the same amount of time there. So here's what it looks like when you first open the form. And you will select open in the Survey123 field app. And when opening the app for the first time, it's going to ask you if the app can access your location, and you want to answer yes, because this will ensure you're accurately collecting data. So here's the survey form. It's pretty self-explanatory to fill in on the surface. So you fill out your name and date and select an affiliation. For example, likely be a member of either member of the public or a partner affiliation, depending on where you work and your relationship with GBBO. Some various attributes that you will be collecting include size of flock, behaviors, distance to flock, and bearing to flock. And we also ask that you take photos in each of the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. And you can do that either directly from the app using this camera icon here, or you can just take them with your camera and then upload them to the app later using the file icon. So just a couple notes on this. Let's see here. So yeah, you'll estimate the size of the flock and the behaviors. For the behaviors, you really can select as many as necessary, but it's best if you select the one that kind of represents the majority of the behavior of the flock. This one, we had 2 selected, so it could be that there was an equal amount of birds foraging on the ground or in shrubs, and an equal amount foraging in trees. Distance to flock is an estimate, and estimating distance can be challenging if you're not used to doing it on a regular basis, but any estimate that you guys have in the field is better than trying to figure it out later, or for example, like asking us to help you guess how far they were. So anything in the field, your best guess is always the best thing to do. Bearing to flock is the direction of the flock from yourself. If you don't have an actual compass, most smartphones do have a compass feature and will allow you to figure out what direction the flock is to use, so north, northwest, or south, and you can write that information in the comments. As a general rule, it's always good to take or write notes in the comments when you're unsure about anything, because that'll help us out later when we're looking at the data. And when you're done, you'll submit your survey. You'll come to GBBO, and if you don't have service at the time when you're in the field, it will be saved in your outbox, and you can submit as soon as you're back to Wi-Fi. So I'm just going to go through a few of the behaviors to look for. Ned did a good job touching on habitat and what habitat they utilize for different things. So their main food source is pine nuts from pinyon pines. It's also been documented in the Great Basin, where evidence suggests that there is an increase in foraging for arthropods during the nesting season. So sometimes you can see them on the ground doing that as well. And as Ned mentioned, edge habitat is very important. So it's good to kind of cue in on what habitat type you may be in when you're out surveying. Pinyon jays often forage on the edges of woodlands, and this picture here at the bottom left is a good example of foraging habitat. You see kind of where the pinyon juniper ends and the sagebrush begins. Their caching sites may be up to several miles away from the source woodland where they find the pine nuts. And pinyon jays will store pine nuts in the ground, and often not always near the base of trees, and sometimes in open sagebrush habitat. This is a pretty easy one, roosting and resting in trees. Roosting sites are often in pinyon pines or can be in ponderosa or juniper. They've been documented traveling 1 to 3 miles from the day's last foraging site to their roosting sites, and they typically do not roost where foraging was last observed. In the Great Basin, evidence suggests higher elevations and dense pinyon juniper woodland may be used for roosting. And resting, sometimes referred to as loafing, means the pinyon jays are just perched, resting, preening in a tree. They're not roosting there, and the behavior does not indicate foraging or nesting. The flock may be simply just resting after foraging. All right, so getting into nesting and breeding behavior. So active breeding season is typically from March to May in most regions. Nesting sites in the Great Basin are typically in areas with denser pinyon juniper than caching sites. You can see the nest locations in this pinyon juniper stand here. It's kind of a bunch pretty close together. So some behavior to look for pinyon jays carrying food, carrying nest material, or displaying agitated or territorial behavior. Any of the behaviors listed here are things to cue in on to confirm nesting activity, though I think you'll likely see carrying food or nest material, that type of thing, before you stumble upon a nest with eggs. And this would be a good time if you do suspect that you are observing any sort of nesting behavior to utilize that comment field in the app, because you do have 1,000 characters at your disposal, so feel free to take notes. Just some notes on surveying near an area where you might suspect there are nesting birds. There are some guidelines to follow to minimize disturbance. The Pinyon Jay Working Group has some great resources on their website, including a few downloadable files shown here. This one at the bottom, I have highlighted guidelines to minimize impacts of data gathering on pinyon jays, has some great information on the do's and don'ts around nesting colonies. And I think most of this kind of refers to if you're out doing a standardized protocol for nest searching, but there is still applicable information and best practices for the more casual observer and things to be aware of if you accidentally stumble upon a nest and what to do. These guidelines are based on the combined experience of multiple researchers from the Pinyon Jay Working Group. So some things to keep in mind. Current data suggests that during the breeding season, pinyon jays may abandon nests or nesting colonies because of excessive human disturbance. So human activity can provide clues or indicators of nest locations to predators such as ravens, who are really smart and cue into our behavior to figure that out. So I suggest checking out the paper in full, but I'll highlight a few things here. So in general, it's a good rule to keep your distance. Nests should never be approached more closely than necessary to confirm their presence. If you suspect nesting behavior, do not survey. If other corvids such as ravens or jays are present or near the suspected colony site, so probably wouldn't be a good idea to go wandering around in that situation. Don't approach a nest and disturb the foliage and look in and draw attention to the area. You can create dead-end scent trails for mammals, so you want to steer clear of that. And if you happen upon a nest unexpectedly, as exciting as that is, you don't want to yell and call everyone over and go look at it. You kind of want to keep walking and keep your distance. So these are just good rules with them when you're out. Again, this resource is downloadable from the Pinyon Jay Working Group website, and the link is here. You can also just Google Pinyon Jay Working Group, and it'll be the first thing that pops up. Okay, so again, here is our link to our community science page. We're pretty excited with all the excitement with Lahat and Audubon and all of you tuning in tonight. We're excited that you're excited about pinyon jays and want to get out there and collect some data for us. So again, we do have more resources on our YouTube channel with other webinars we've done about pinyon jays to gain some insight. The Pinyon Jay Working Group is a great resource. And also keep an eye out, we're working on an ArcGIS Pinyon Jay hub site, which will be kind of a go-to place to explore data and all things Pinyon Jay. So we're hoping to have that up early next year, which is coming up pretty quick. So keep an eye out for that. And thanks again to Lahontan Audubon for having us tonight. And please let us know if you have any questions.
Thanks so much for that, Kayla, and Ned. That was great. Looks like we had a comment earlier from Rebecca that she's up in Spanish Springs and they've been raiding her feeders daily back in September. And Laura asked, do they migrate?
They are not migratory, but they do move around a lot.
Great. And if folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. You can also raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can theoretically ask your question live. We haven't tried that out yet, but we can give that a shot. I've also put a number of links in the chat for folks to see. The first one is the Christmas bird count that we talked about at the beginning, but also some of the links that Kayla shared in her talk, the GBBO's community science page and Partners in Flight's Pinyon Jay working group page. And the last one is our volunteer form. If you are interested in volunteering for LAS to do some of these surveys, please go to our volunteer page. It's under Get Involved on our website. And under the Conservation Committee, there is the option to select Pinyon Jay surveys, and that way we can keep a record of who is interested in participating in those, and we can keep you posted on trainings and all the stuff that's going on with the Pinyon Jay surveys. We have another question here. Do several birds in a flock know where the caches are? Or do they each have their own caches?
They each have their own, and they have remarkable abilities to recover these and come back to their caches. Their spatial memory and recognition is impressive, and a lot of studies with the parents recognizing their specific young in amongst a whole big flock, and their ability to only feed their offspring. It's truly impressive, their capabilities. There's a lot more going on than one might think.
Great. This is definitely an interesting question and potentially a hot button issue for the Pinyon Jays is, do any of the conservation efforts for wild horses or sage-grouse affect the Pinyon Jays positively or negatively?
I think that is going to have to be answered with a big fat question mark. As I mentioned in one of my slides, it's functionally unstudied and unknown. There have been a few studies with preliminary results and stuff, but largely this is unknown. And I mean, you can imagine what the logical conclusion is based on the data that we are finding, but inconclusive. Hard to say for sure with that one. It's pretty much why we are implementing all these citizen science programs and trying to get more people out there, more eyes, collecting more data to get a more full understanding of the picture and everything that's going on to manage all, like I said, these cultural priorities and all that. There's a lot to consider. So no, I don't think it has to be one at the expense of the other. There's definitely a way to manage for all species. It's just going to require collecting more data and figuring out what these birds are really honing in on and what characters we really need to preserve in the habitats we're managing.
All right. Is the Clark's nutcracker related to the Pinyon Jay? One hides seeds at high elevation, the other at mid elevation.
They are both in the corvid family, and they are both Clark's nutcracker is to the white bark pine as Pinyon Jays are to the pinyon pine. They are very ecological analogs, you might say.
Right. Parker, are we getting any questions in from Facebook land out there?
None submitted so far.
All right. I actually have a couple of questions about the citizen science project. And I think other people may be wondering, why can't this information just be, why isn't eBird information good enough? There's a lot of data there, but I know that there's a specific reason why you guys are wanting citizen science for them.
Ned, I think
What's that? Oh,
So,
did I cut out? Did you cut out?
nope, I've got you, Ned.
Oh,
Kayla froze
Kayla
on
cut
me.
Well, I'll give you 9,000 reasons why we don't want to just take eBird data, but no, that we want more detailed info. We want behavior. We want more specific location, specific habitat, distance to edge, number of birds in the flock. We need a lot more than just, I was vaguely near this location and I saw this many Pinyon Jays is not really going to be enough to inform management decisions. Not to mention general data quality concerns with eBird data, but we don't need to go there.
And along with that, you mentioned that absences were an important data point. Can you give a little bit of a description about why absence data is so as equally important to presence data sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely. It's informing these management decisions. It's equally important to know areas they're not using. If we have a systematic way to determine areas they're not using, we can develop patterns of, okay, they are consistently not using these kind of habitats, and that kind of information is equally valuable as to what types of habitats they are choosing to use.
Great.
So the key is being systematic, not just hopping out of your truck and saying, nope, no Pinyon Jays here, next, you know.
Yep.
yeah, and that's why we have a minimum time limit to spend in an area as well. But from our experience, if they're around, you'll know usually. They're pretty conspicuous.
That is one nice thing. Sometimes surveying can be very difficult and you don't know if there is a true absence or not, but it's nice when the species you're working with is a jabberjaws.
And I meant to touch on this when I was talking about the telemetry stuff I did, but it was pretty impressive, the ability of these birds. They, as conspicuous as they are, they can be pretty sneaky. They had their little transmitters and I had my receiver and I could track them down, find myself in the midst of a flock. And, okay, there's a bird or two, there's a couple birds here. And then something spooks them after I've been observing them for 15 minutes. And there's 200 birds within 100 meters of you. And I wouldn't have had any means to estimate that number at all.
Yeah, and they can be very quiet around nesting colonies too. So there's that.
Good point.
Yes, they're very clever.
All right, Alan DeCaros is asking, the area on Peavine where I've seen Pinyon Jays is also the site of a planned housing development. Do you have any thoughts or experience on how a housing development could be completed without destroying the habitat for the jays?
Again, I think this is going to come back to that question of these habitat characters that they're keying in on and what is really driving their selection, because as a lot of people have mentioned, they come to their feeders, so they're not avoiding humans and human developments. So yes, I think there is a way, but it also, again, depends on the caliber of the development that's happening, like a massive large scale housing area, or if it's a small neighborhood, or the specifics of the site are going to play into that too. But yeah.
All right. If anybody has any last questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. As I mentioned, please fill out the volunteer form if you are interested in doing some surveys for LAS with this project. You are always welcome to do surveys anywhere that you see jays or you would expect to see jays and you have absences. But we are going to be putting GBBO is going to be putting together some targeted locations, and we'll also be putting together some training. So you can get experience using the app, using the survey form, and kind of getting comfortable with what's going on, as well as those targeted locations will help specifically fill in some areas that we don't have information on or we need more information on. So stay tuned for that information. Not seeing any more questions in the chat, so I want to thank Ned and Kayla so much for your presentation tonight. I learned a lot, and I hope everybody else did too. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Rose, for bringing this project to LAS, Diane and Parker for their tireless work, as well as all of our other volunteers. And we are planning a talk in January for our meeting to be on seabirds, and that talk will be from Dr. Podolsky. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And he'll be sharing some work that he has done specifically on puffins, albatross, shearwaters, and petrels. So stay tuned for some more information on that. And hope everybody has happy holidays and a happy new year, and you're staying safe and warm out there. And thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.